I would say he's the fastest one-lap man at the moment. Could argue based on, 2021 season with Hamilton and even just other seasons, he's not really someone to leave the gap.
Obviously, you don't want people being run over by Formula One cars in the pit lane. Welcome back to another episode of Fine Margins. I am Ben. I'm obviously joined by my co-host Bella. So we are here after the Azerbaijan Grand Prix at the Baku City Circuit. A weekend which included a new confusing sprint race edition, somewhat of a Ferrari comeback, more Red Bull dominance, and a pit lane arguably more exciting than the race. In this episode of Fine Margins, we will cover the entire weekend, including the new sprint format and how it works, the race result and key takeaways in each team's performance, and what this all means for the championship. So, jumping in straight away, let's talk about the new sprint format that came in this weekend for the first time. So this was quite different to a traditional F1 event. Friday, however, started off kind of with what we expected, with a free practice session. However, this was the only free practice session of the entire weekend. This was followed on by a quali session, which would set the grid for the Sunday race. Saturday is where we saw the biggest change. There was an introduction of a new feature called the sprint shootout, which is a shortened version of quali, which sets the grid for the sprint race later. However, on top of being a shortened version, you also have to use a specific tire compound for each session. So in the Q1 of the sprint shootout and Q2, you have to use the medium compound tire, and for Q3, you have to use the soft compound tire. So it kind of adds another dynamic of strategizing for what tires you want to have ready on the race weekend. And then later that day on Saturday, there was the sprint race, which is similar to the traditional sprint race that we've seen for the last couple of years, where the first 8 drivers get points. However, like I mentioned before, the grid is set by the Friday quali session, not by the sprint race, which was kind of what was the case for previous years. But if we jump into thoughts on the new format, Bella, did you like it? Did you enjoy it? What did you think about it?
Yeah, so the new sprint format, the question is, where does the idea come from? And obviously a big theme since Liberty Media took over F1 and generally through we've seen the new regulations and all this thing is increasing raceability in F1 entertainment, right? So it seems really clear to me they, especially for like new viewers of F1, the reason a sprint race is interesting or perceived to be interesting is because it's super quick. You don't have to watch a race for an hour and a half. It's very clear, like who wins, who doesn't. There are no pit stops, none of this. And having almost like a quali for the sprint, it means that I guess maybe they'll get some viewers just for the Saturday. But in all, and I think we just saw from your conversation is, I think they've actually made it more confusing because at the end of the day, the full race is the race on the Sunday. But then we have this weird kind of setup in the middle, and I'm not sure that, yes, it increased entertainment per se because, you have more crashes and there's more for the teams to do and all this stuff, but I don't actually think it helps the overall case of watching F1 and increasing viewership and increasing entertainment. Like, it's almost like a quick fix. Because if the races were a little bit tighter, they kind of wouldn't have to do that. And I do think, it increases a little bit of confusion.
And I'd say, firstly, it's confusing as a viewer. If you're a diehard fan of Formula One, then you'll probably keep up to date with all these updates, so you have an understanding of what's happening with, like, how the Friday quali session sets the grid for Sunday, and then the sprint shootout session would set the grid for the sprint race. If you're more of a casual viewer, you don't watch every race, you don't watch every free practice session, you'll probably jump in on this week and be like, well, what the hell is happening? I have no idea what's going on. And I think, well, firstly, I've never been a big fan of the sprint race because it's a race without any of the strategy or any of the variables that come into play, which could impact the grid. And in addition, I just think they keep trying to improve the product, which is a good thing in any form of entertainment. But I feel like they keep tiptoeing around the bigger issue, which is that they've changed the regulations to improve racing, but racing's not kind of visually become any better because of the fact that it's too easy to overtake in some places with straight line DRS and straight line speed. And as most kind of drivers and commentators say, overtaking with DRS is not really I mean, obviously it's overtaking like in the literal sense of you get in front of the car, but there's no challenge behind it. It's just foot down, sprint past a car, get in front of him. So there's a lot less overtaking we see in the corners, which is, comes down a lot more to the skill of the driver. So it's difficult because I think there's a lot of races this year, and especially this one, this wasn't the most fascinating race we've ever seen. And on top of that, the sprint race was not the most fascinating sprint race I've ever seen, and it was a bit chaotic, but overall the core product is still struggling a little bit, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. We're still seeing that development gap between, and we'll see it in the constructors lineup, that development gap between those top teams in the midfield and even between the top teams themselves, as we'll kind of go into. It's really clear that Red Bull are, immensely dominant, and that kind of means there's no surprise that they've won yet another weekend. So exactly. And then I think another con of perhaps the sprint race is the fact that it unfairly disadvantages the smaller teams. So why does that happen? Well, when you have less free practices and kind of less ability to run the testing and set up the car and like more race events, and in any race event, you're more likely to crash because you're competing versus a quali. With having the sprint shootout and then the sprint race, people are more likely to crash. And exactly like you kind of once said when we were watching the race, is that the problem with that is the smaller teams that already don't have enough budget are just spending more time rebuilding their cars than they are improving their cars. And then the other counter argument is that in an era of a budget cap, when you're causing teams to do more in the same weekend and also, stretch their personnel and potentially be more likely to crash, like you're making it harder and harder to meet an already tight budget cap.
No, but exactly. In this budget cap era of Formula One, if you crash your car, it cost you, obviously, it costs you to rebuild the car, but it means you have to take away resources from potential R&D to make your car faster in the future. That's taken away, and it has to go towards fixing your car in the moment, and that's because you're adding so many more levels of competitiveness in a weekend, and teams just don't have the data to prepare correctly for these sessions.
No. And when the car's not set up properly, you're much more likely to have those crashes and have that kind of lack of balance. In terms of the results of all of those different parts of the weekend, so for quali, it was a Leclerc pole. I would say he's the fastest one-lap man at the moment. Red Bull were 2 and 3. Merckx and Aston Martin lost pace or didn't have the pace relative to the front of the grid. But on the other side, McLaren's updates seem to have made them a little bit faster, and of course the Alpines caught fire. In the sprint shootout, you had Leclerc on pole again, Red Bull 2-3 again, and then Merckx had a better session than they did in quali. And then finally in the sprint race, it was a Perez win, and he obviously also won the race. And Max and Russell kind of had contact, which caused a lot of the news coverage after and tension between the two drivers. So yeah, that was kind of the weekend pre-race elements of the weekend and the results and the relative merits. Now, if we go into the key takeaways of the race, really simply, the big question I think that came out of it is the gap between Verstappen and Perez smaller than we perhaps give Perez credit for? He's now obviously won 2 races this season, 4 races in, which is incredibly interesting potentially for the championship. Ferrari seemed to suffer the same kind of lack of pace issue. I mean, we just saw how easy it was for Max and Perez to overtake him in the race. I think there were points where just generally in their overtaking, they were not using DRS, which is crazy. Merck and Aston Martin are still quite close to each other, but the AMRs are still a little bit quicker, and Mercedes is struggling with the pace. And then overall, I think someone to stand out is that Nick de Vries generally hasn't had a great start to the year. So yeah, if we kick off each team's performance, and we start with the Red Bulls, who qualified 2nd and 3rd and finished 1st and 2nd with a Checo win.
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly they've still got the most dominant car on the grid. That's very clear to see. If you look at their race results, Max had the lead, and he had, somewhat of a unlucky moment where he pitted just before the yellow flag. So Checo pitted second during the yellow flag and got to maintain the lead, because obviously you lose a lot less time when you pit under a safety car or virtual safety car than you would if you pitted during the normal race procedures. However, I don't think that's the reason why Perez won the race, because Max had around 40-ish laps to catch up and overtake Perez, but Perez just maintained that gap between 1 and 2. And so he was just simply the fastest driver this weekend. He matched Max in quali pace. He obviously won the sprint race, and I thought he was the better driver on the day for the race weekend. But all in all, just about maximum points for Red Bull. 1 and 2 in the sprint race, 1 and 2 in the race. They've really got nothing to complain about at the moment. They're living the dream.
100%. Then we have Ferrari, who qualified 1st and 4th and finished 3rd and 5th. I think this probably been their best weekend so far. I think it's good to see that Leclerc still has that 1 lap pace. The Ferrari as a car, though, doesn't in comparison to the Red Bulls. But Sainz was kind of off the pace, and I think we're seeing mirrors to what happened last season. In the first half of the season, he wasn't as quick as Leclerc. I do think it's quite clear, like, there is a little bit of a gap between those two drivers, but no major mishaps for Ferrari. Like, they did not win because of anything that they did. I think their car is just slower.
Yeah. I think one thing just on the Sainz point, I think he's making it harder and harder for Ferrari to keep him, because it seems like for the majority of the time, he seems to be off the pace to Leclerc. And, you know, he doesn't have the longest contract in the world. He just signed a new one last year, I think for 2 years. But it's hard to see him getting re-signed again, because it seems like year after year, outside of the fantastic year he had in 2021, he's just off the pace of death.
Yeah, I agree. Aston Martin
started 6th and 9th, finished 4th and 7th. It was another very good performance by Alonso, the wily old fox. He just knows racing. He strategizes
whilst he races
so well while he races,
which is
he knows he uses. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, go for it.
It's just his tactic of he lets people push, and he lets people kind of waste their tires, and he just hangs back, just waiting for the right moment to pounce and overtake people. I mean, he's a fantastic. I mean, he's pure experience and racecraft.
And you saw that and the merits of that in how he was relaying to his engineer to relay to Lance Stroll the best brake balance for the race, because Lance was kind of struggling a little bit, and obviously took that corner wide where Hamilton overtook him and Russell. And I'm not sure whether this is why Lawrence Stroll brought him in, obviously Fernando is an incredible driver and they want a championship winning driver in their car, but equally they want a mentor for Lance. And I think when you have stuff like that happening, you can see Lance learning from the best.
And it's very wholesome to see that relationship. It's because I do think the two drivers like each other.
Yeah.
So it is just very nice to see. And it's always nice to see a happy Alonso. So as much as we love Alonso when he's making quick-witted comments on the radios and towards other drivers, which is it's very amusing when that happens, but it is very nice to see a happy Alonso. But all in all, a good weekend for Aston Martin. You know, a slightly, I guess, a step back from their first 3 races, because they got 3 podiums from 3 races. But all in all, I don't think they'll be completely unhappy about what happened.
No, and then obviously moving to their main competitors, the Mercedes, who qualified 5th and 11th. Not a great quali for George, didn't have the pace to get into Q3 and finished 5th and 8th. So Hamilton was quicker than Russell this weekend. In the sprint race, the big kind of news was Russell colliding with Max and damaging Max's car. Obviously, we're not going to go into the depths of whose fault that was. Max claims that he wasn't given space, etc., etc. But even with the damaged car, Red Bull was quicker. But overall, the Mercedes had a solid race. But
it's incredible, because I mean, there was a big chunk, there was a big hole in that side pod for Max. and the thing about having a big hole in your side pod is, firstly, you will lose downforce, so you're probably a bit slow around the corners and all that. But on top of that, it's very draggy. Because it's like when you're driving with your windows down, you get a lot more drag than you would before. And they overtook him like it was nothing, you know?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, all in all, Sorry,
also
what were you saying?
seems the Mercedes, like you say, like obviously having two great drivers, they always get close to the other drivers. But then when it gets to that point of overtaking them in DRS, they just don't seem to have that
No.
final bit to like
And
get
it
around.
happened a couple times. And Hamilton was trying to close the gap on Sainz, and he was under that 1 second. He got it down to like 6 tenths, 5 tenths, 4 tenths behind him,
Yeah.
and he just couldn't do it. And he's having the same issue with Stroll, I think. And if Stroll didn't go wide, Hamilton wouldn't have overtaken him. Not saying that not saying he wouldn't have overtaken him later in the race, but it just seems like it just lacks some speed, and they lack some straight line speed still at this moment. So yeah, it's a bit of a step back for them, considering they finished second. They finish second in Australia? Hamilton finished second in Australia. Yeah. So a step back, but they've got their upgrades coming to Imola, which is not the next race, because the next race is in Miami. It's the race after that. So Hamilton did come out and say he is counting down the days for that upgrade package.
But moving on to someone who just got their upgrade package in place is McLaren, who overall I think is probably one of their better weekends of this season.
Absolutely. Well, this is the car that they said they should have started the season with.
Right.
So it clearly looks faster, because they looked faster in just pure pace. Because I'd say they had a better weekend last week at Australia, but they had such a good weekend because, like we mentioned before, half the grid didn't finish. So because half the grid doesn't finish, you have to end up in the points. Like, it just has to happen. But this week they kind of got where they finished on pure pace and pure merit.
Yeah.
Clearly a better weekend for them. The car seems faster. Let's see how much they can develop it.
Yeah.
Both cars made it to Q3, which is great. Lando Norris ended up in the points. Oscar Piastri just missed out on the points. But all in all, a better weekend.
Yeah. Then moving on to the Alpines, who on the flip side had a disastrous weekend. Gasly's car caught fire in FP1. He then proceeded to have a crash in quali. They didn't make it to Q3.
He had a dreadful weekend.
There was no points in the sprint race or the race, and Ocon nearly ran people over in the pit lane when he was doing his pit on the final lap of the race. And people from other teams were kind of already celebrating and running across the pit wall.
Photographers on the pit lane, and it was and it's funny because
disastrous for Alpine.
You were watching some Sky Sports, and the commentators were saying
just running out the race.
Well, no, they were saying Ocon's not pitted, and they somewhat predicted it. They could see it coming, because like, well, Ocon has a pit. Ocon needs a pit, and the pit lane is flooded with people. You know, the photographers are out. The Red Bull engineers, they ran to the fence to celebrate.
So people literally jumped out of the way. But did Ocon get told that people?
I'm not sure. Lane? I've not heard the team regs.
Did he lock up?
He must have been told. No, he didn't lock up. People kind of dodged out the way quite quickly. Right. He didn't have to stop. He was still moving.
Okay.
I imagine he was told by the engineers.
Yeah, don't come in hot.
That's run
super
people
dangerous,
over.
Though. That is
super dangerous. So I imagine Formula One or the FIA will be looking into that.
And how that
because
happened.
Obviously that is unacceptable, because those photographers and those engineers should have not been let loose. Someone should have told them that, or the team should have told them that. Someone obviously had a moment of oversight and let this happen, so they will have to investigate and review so this doesn't happen again, because obviously you don't want people being run over by Formula One cars in the pit lane.
And then if we're looking at the rest of the grid, so AlphaTauri, Tsunoda had a really good weekend relative to his teammate Nick de Vries. Qualified 8th, obviously finished 10th because the AlphaTauri isn't that quick, but really good weekend from him, and good to see him holding his own relative to Nick, who's not really having a great season.
No, absolutely. Well, firstly, it's great for Tsunoda because obviously with Gasly going last year, or this year, Tsunoda is the man at AlphaTauri now, so he can't really blame his poor performances on being young and experienced and stuff like that, because he's been in Formula One for a couple of years now. He said this summer he spent a lot of work in the gym, getting his fitness levels up to have full concentration for these 4 races, and on top of that, he was saying that in his previous years, he was kind of just trying stuff out when he was racing. Now he knows what he's doing. So he's been very good this season. Nick de Vries has not been good. And it's difficult to see, because we all had big expectations for Nick de Vries because he was a Formula E world champion. And on top of that, the one race he raced at last year for Williams, he finished in the points. So there were some expectations put on Nick de Vries, but he has not been great. So I'm wondering have we been has there been a bit of fool's gold with Nick de Vries? Is he not the driver we expect him to be? Or is that AlphaTauri not a great car?
Yeah.
Is it in rookie season? Is he just learning? So we don't know, but what we do know is that he's not been great.
Yeah.
He had a very bad weekend. He crashed in Q1, caused a red flag. He crashed in the race, effing because of that. So these aren't retirements. These aren't like engine exploding, power unit failure. This is him making mistakes as a driver.
Yeah. In terms of everyone else, Alfa Romeo, kind of no points and also off the pace. Haas, not a great weekend. And then Williams had some kind of quick moments, but nothing really to shout home about. In terms of the impact in the Drivers and Constructors Championships, in terms of the drivers, Max is obviously still first. Then we have Checo behind
Fernando Alonso. Sorry, yeah. Checo, which is just on his tail. So I imagine
with 6
that
points
will be
between them, right?
Yeah, I imagine that will be the championship battle this year. I love it.
Interesting, to be honest.
I love it.
Really interesting.
I hope Red Bull don't play favoritism towards Max.
No.
And I hope that Checo can remain consistent to put up a real fight towards
100%,
Max.
100%.
Next is Fernando Alonso, followed by Lewis Hamilton, followed by Carlos Sainz, followed by Charles Leclerc, followed by George Russell, Lance Stroll, Lando Norris, and then Nico Hülkenberg to kind of top up the top 10. If you look at the Constructors' Championship, it is Red Bull, Aston Martin, Merc, Ferrari, McLaren, Alpine, Haas, and
Alfa
then just Alfa Romeo, and then just the rest of the grid.
Big gap
Williams.
Between the midfield and the fastest teams.
Substantial gap between McLaren and Ferrari. Ferrari are 4th, McLaren are 5th, and there is already a 50-point gap in place.
Yep.
So that midfield gap is widening. It's nice to see Aston Martin kind of break out of that midfield to be into the top 4 teams, because it used to be the top 3 teams. Now it seems to be the top 4 teams.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a wider gap now between kind of the podium chasing teams and the rest of the grid. And this changed just for McLaren, because McLaren, there's been expectations of McLaren for a few years now, because they've been quite consistent in the midfield to then break into that top 3, top 4. But they've not made that step.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is exactly why this case of the entertainment factor and F1 trying to plaster over the fact that they actually can't reduce the gaps between the cars. If we move into a roundup of the F1 news that you need to know about, obviously people kind of making the argument of, is Max being hypocritical, getting so annoyed at George because of leaving the gap, and that he's always someone to leave the gap. I think anyone could argue, based on 2021 season with Hamilton and even just other seasons, he's not really someone to leave the gap, but that's kind of a different thing. Franz Tost, in big news, is being replaced by Laurent Mekies, Ferrari's race director, by the end of the year. And this kind of stems on the big thing that's been happening at Ferrari, which is that a lot of their engineers are leaving, and there is kind of a big leadership and personnel shift with, the kind of new CEO of Ferrari as a group, putting in the place the likes of Fred Vasseur, and the expectations that are coming down with this. And at all levels, Ferrari is seeing a big change in top leadership personnel. If you're more interested in what's been going on at Ferrari, why this has been happening, and who's been leaving, we have an episode on that. You can go and check that out.
Yes, we do. I'd say just a quick point on that, kind of the Max Verstappen situation. It is ironic, and I do think it is somewhat hypocritical, because as talented as a driver Max is, especially in 2021, Max's pattern move to overtake was diving down the inside.
Yeah, when there's no space. Yeah.
When there's, when there's no space, when there's a bit of space, and he would get his elbows out and he would force to make that space.
Yeah, contact or let me through. Yeah.
Contact or let me through. Exactly. And obviously, I think Russell's a very poised driver. He's not, a completely reckless driver. And he went for a narrow gap, but I do believe that's something that Max would do as well. So it is a difficult situation, but it was entertaining to see. It is. I'm sure Max fans will love what happened. I'm sure people that don't like Max will obviously kind of point that out and say, oh, that's exactly how he behaved. He's a bit of a diva. But it is entertaining to see, and it adds another dynamic to the sport.
Yeah.
We kind of we do like it when drivers kind of collide and in the media and face to face, because it does add a different element to the sport.
Yep. And that is it for this week's race recap. Join us at the next race in Miami and keep a lookout for the Let Her Drive episodes that have been coming out to give a platform to all the women in F1. And with that, thank you very much for listening.